video's recording. So, where you go, Gavin?
Good, yeah. Ready to go, yeah?
Yeah, that's it. I'm fine.
So, if you could just introduce yourself and what you do.
I am Patsy McGarry, the Religious Affairs Correspondent of the Irish Times. I've been in this role since 1997. When I came into it, my primary interest really was to do with religion and politics in Ireland, because I had been working in the political area journalistically up to that point. My primary interest in particular was Northern Ireland, and the Drum Creek crisis had just begun in the previous couple of years. And I really, my emphasis was on that area, and I covered Drum Creek for my sins for 8 years in a row, marching with the Orangemen from this religious affairs perspective, which is quite an education for a Southern Irishman in itself, and a very good one, if I might say so. The abuse issue had begun to emerge before I came into this area. Father Brendan Smith was jailed for the first time in Northern Ireland in 1993. He was jailed here in the summer of 1997, just shortly after I took over this job. But I had no idea what was coming down the tracks. And really, Cardinal Desmond O'Connell once said that the abuse issue devastated his ministry, well, has dominated my ministry since I took over 17 years ago. It really has. The abuse issue in the Catholic Church is by far and away the biggest story I've ever covered in my career. And I feel, from a journalist's point of view, to have been very privileged to be witness such a huge event. I don't say that lightly. I say specifically from a journalistic point of view, because there's been so much tragedy involved in it, particularly where abuse victims and their families are concerned. And that is an ongoing matter for them and their families, and will be as long as they're on this earth.
Sorry, I'll just move this slightly closer.
Yeah, just watch the fan or something.
Yeah.
Sorry, lads, I thought we might be able to.
No, it's
No, it's fine. It's coming through all right there. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. So, how do you think the abuse issue had a major impact on the volume of young men applying to be priests?
I think right across the board, where the Catholic Church in Ireland is concerned, and indeed internationally, the effects of the abuse issue have been deep and profound. In Ireland, it really has hastened the demise of a particular model of Catholic Church we've had here since the middle decades of the 19th century. A church that was really created by a man who I've often thought is underestimated in Irish history, and very wrongly so, Cardinal Paul Cullen. He was the first Irish cardinal, and he created that Irish church in the image of and likeness of what Rome wanted, under a very domineering Pope at the time, Pius IX, who was a personal friend of Paul Cullen's. He brought in all these pious practices like weekly Mass on Sundays, devotions, processions, Corpus Christi processions, a very clerically dominated church, a hugely controlling church, which set up a network of first of all, primary schools. Indeed, primary education in Ireland, which was there since 1831, was modelled on denominational lines, and to be fair, it wasn't the Catholic Church that insisted on that. It was the Presbyterians initially, and then the Church of Ireland, because they felt that their pupils would be dominated in Catholic-controlled schools because of numbers. So then they insisted on having their own schools, so you had Catholic schools. Then you had the setting up of a network of Catholic secondary schools, which were really junior seminaries. Every diocese had its own junior seminary, which often was the only available secondary education for young Catholic laymen, and the convents were set up similar schools for girls. And he was hugely instrumental in that in the later decades of the 19th century. And then he tried to set up the university, the Catholic University under Cardinal Newman, which was a bit of a disaster, because Newman, though a genius and a wonderful writer, wasn't an administrator. He's blessed now, beatified by Pope Benedict in England in 2006, I think it was. It became, in time, UCD. But Paul Cullen set the framework for the Catholic Church that dominated Ireland for most of the 20th century. And that's the model of church that has now imploded, or is still imploding, making way, I expect, for a new model of church.
Excellent. And how do you think the church will recruit young men going forward if the old model is imploding?
I think the church is in for a period of continuing decline in terms of vocations. That is the pattern. I think there's one vocation, one priest, one man likely to be ordained in this Dublin Archdiocese this year, the biggest diocese in Ireland. The average age of a Catholic priest today is 65. They retire at 75. As the Americans say, you do the math. What you have already is a major clustering of parishes all over Ireland, in every diocese in Ireland. Priests are moving out of areas that many people would feel they had no relevance in anyhow. Administration, finance, whatever, into the purely spiritual role for which most people would believe they have been ordained. That is the saying of Mass and the administration of the sacraments. And that will be the future, I do believe, in Ireland, as has already happened in continental Europe. I mean, there are dioceses in the south of France, for instance, where lay people conduct baptisms, they conduct the liturgy of the word with communion, which has been consecrated at a Eucharist by a priest in advance. In other words, a Mass without a priest. They conduct funeral services, they officiate at weddings, and most of these people, these lay people, doing all these things are women. And that is the way it is going in Ireland. Women tend to be the most active people in parishes anyhow. And that has always been the pattern, regardless of the current situation. So you're going to see, and you are seeing, increased lay involvement in the Catholic Church in Ireland at every level, up to and including the liturgy. And that's how the Catholic Church will get through the current crisis of manpower until you also have, of course, the ordination of a new permanent diaconate. There are about 26 such men in Ireland so far. But it has to be said that most of those men are of a similar age to the priests that they are assisting. You will see probably an increase in vocations after a plateau period, and the issue is how long will that plateau period last. Some people feel that plateau has been reached already, but it has stagnated at a certain level, and we have to wait and see what happens. I mean, one of the most positive developments in that area is the arrival or the election of Pope Francis, a man who really has gripped the imagination of the world, not just the Catholic world. And depending on how successful he is and also how he can sustain this initial bout of enthusiasm, it could lead to vocations, as the visit of John Paul did to Ireland in 1979. It was followed by quite a jump in vocations.
Excellent. So the plateau we're going through now, there's still some people coming through the plateau. What kind of personalities are those people coming through the plateau?
Well, what you find mainly with the men who are now going for the priesthood or deciding that they have a vocation is that they're older. They're usually men who have been living out in the world for a while. They're not coming straight from secondary school, as was the pattern in the past. Many people believe that that is much more healthy. They understand life better. They have lived outside of an institutional context, whereas in the past, a young man went from one institution into a seminary, which is another institution, into a parish or a diocesan context, which is another institution. In other words, they never lived in the real world that most people had to compete with. They were always protected. They always had the shelter of an institution, whatever it was, which I do think contributes to the difficulties that the Church has faced or which have been exposed in recent years. So I think they're a better type, therefore, of men. They're more rounded as human beings, more understanding probably as human beings. I'm not saying that priests in the past, or even priests who earned late vocations, are not rounded or good people. They are, of course, in the main. But that is the pattern: late vocations, fewer vocations, and I think that will be the trend for the foreseeable, or rather the immediate future.
Father John Gilligan said himself that the Church is making a deliberate effort not to recruit from a young age. The Church wants young men to have a bit of life experience behind them. He also mentioned that the young men who are being drawn to the priesthood now it's pure because it's from their own want. It's that there's no external pressures as there used to be external pressures. Do you think that's a healthy thing?
I think absolutely. I mean, one of the sad facts of the past is that because of the deference shown to the priest in society, because of the fact that he was an elevated individual, he had quite considerable status, that the status factor probably influenced young men in thinking they had a vocation to become a priest. You don't have that today. I mean, the man who wants to be a priest in the current climate is probably a very genuine personality. I mean, it has been said in the past, indeed by myself, that Ireland had a plethora of priests in the mid-decades of the 20th century. I mean, there were so many in the 1950s up to 1961, in fact. I think that's when Pope John XXIII said that described Ireland as the most fruitful of mothers in this area. Between a quarter and a third of Irish priests had to go abroad, to go on the missions, because there was nothing for them to do here. On the other hand, it was said that the seminaries of Ireland in the 1950s were full of young men whose mothers had vocations to the priesthood. There was that huge status factor that was it influenced families where priesthood was concerned, and it pushed, either often unconsciously, these young men into roles they may not necessarily have chosen in a free way had they that freedom themselves. It was also often the only way a man could get education, or a woman in the past. It was through going into the clergy, whether it be priests or becoming nuns. So you are talking about, I would feel, a more pure decision today in what is often perceived to be a hostile climate for what is not as an attractive profession as it used to be in the past.
So it's a much more braver decision than it would have been.
It's braver, it demands a greater commitment, much more thorough interrogation of the self, a much more deep conviction of faith. That probably was the case for a lot of guys in the past.
Apart from the abuse scandals that have happened, is there any other reasons why a man in 21st century Ireland would need a deeper conviction of faith to be a priest?
Well, I mean, the abuse scandals, what they did do was exacerbate a trend. There was already a falling away in Ireland from practice, a falling away of numbers of vocations since the 1960s period, when, well, you had Vatican II, of course, but also you had in Ireland, anyhow, the introduction of mass education at a secondary and third level. Up to the late 1960s, only those who could afford it got a secondary education, and certainly only those who could afford it got a third level education. With the introduction of so-called free education in 1967 by the then Minister for Education, Donald O'Malley, the doors were suddenly thrown open to huge numbers of young people by comparison with the previous years. It also meant that people were less dependent upon the church for education. At secondary level in particular, most schools today now would not be controlled by the church at second level, even though they still control most schools at primary level. And that meant that people were outside the influence of church in many ways, and certainly at third level. And they began to think independently. And you had a generation coming through in the 70s who were quite rebellious against what was before, and they led what have been described as the moral civil wars of the 70s, 80s, 90s, indeed right up to last year with the Protection of Life During Pregnancy Bill, where they challenged things like the banning of contraception, they challenged things like the banning of divorce, they challenged things like the banning of abortion, a row and a fight that still goes on, and a very, very bitter one. They challenged the church on these areas which the church would regard as sacred, or which had been taboo up to that. There were people who owed nothing to the church, and so were outside of it. They became a secularizing influence, and I mean that secularizing influence is hugely influential today, and has been indeed over the last 30 plus years, I mean 40 plus years at this stage, and that is something that a young man considering the priesthood has also to consider today, is secularism and the power and influence of secularism in society. Some people describe it as aggressive secularism. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think it's seen as it is a very valid position and highly influential, and if not becoming dominant, certainly near to being so today in modern Ireland as well as it is in European society today. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for religion or religious conviction in such a context. Of course not. There is. And but I mean, a young man going off the priesthood today has also to contend with that, and to contend with a society that is more sceptical than was the case in the past, and he has to have answers. Not only for that society, but for himself. His faith is challenged really to its very, very core, much more so today than in a society that was so Catholic and so religious that the idea of questioning the existence of God was anathema. I remember asking in secondary school myself, asking a priest, "Father, but how do we know there's a God?" And the man was absolutely thrown by the question. It was like asking him, "How do we know there's air?" I mean, it was so basic and elemental to him that the question never arose. This is a man he was a young priest at the time, and he probably never interrogated himself to that degree. It was just part and parcel of what he was, and the world he belonged to was as well. It was unquestioned, and that is not the case anymore. Anybody entering the priesthood today will, first of all, for his own sake, have to have, if you like, brought his faith through the white heat of challenge, and then have become almost diamond-like, hardened through conviction, so that for his own sake initially, and then so that he can respond intelligently and rationally to the questions society poses.
Do you think that creates...
Sorry to text, just because obviously it gives you 15
Oh,
minutes.
yeah.
So the style of camera only lets us record for 15 minutes, then you need to restart it. Okay, sorry.
We go, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you think that creates a more conservative kind of pre-Vatican II kind of priest?
Not at all. In my experience, and I wouldn't be unique in this, probably the finest priests, Irish priests, are those men who worked in hostile environments, in the mission fields of South America, Africa, where they'd be dealing with, I mean, from a Christian point of view, very hostile, ignorant, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, I mean ignorant of Christianity, Maybe they may have other religions like Islam or tribal religions with belief in their own local deities or whatever. And they were very broad-minded human beings. They had an immense embrace of tolerance and understanding and compassion that related to the person rather than the belief system that they held. And I often think that Francis seems to come from that sort of background. He has that. And I mean, I was at his very first audience, which was on the 16th of March last year, 3 days after he was elected. It was the first audience he gave, which was to the media. And he was just so relaxed and so at ease, very different to his predecessor, who was he was the classic professor and was prepared. He had his script. This man had a script which he abandoned and came back to doing told jokes. But at the very end, he came out a line that really, really struck me very forcefully. He says, "I know most of you here are not Catholics. I know many of you are not believers. And I respect your conscience. But to me, you're all children of God." And he blessed them silently. And there's a word about respecting your conscience as a non-believer or as a non-Catholic that really hit home, not just with me, but with other journalists there as well. I mean, most journalists would be skeptics almost by nature. I say to my colleagues that the patron saint of journalists should be Thomas, who insisted on putting his finger into the hand before he would believe that Christ was crucified. And it had a profound effect, that recognition, and that came out of a culture which, I mean, we see as monolithic in Buenos Aires and in South America, but his experience, and he was spent most of the time in the ghettos, where his concern was simply with the physical conditions and the suffering of people rather than what they believed in. And that's coming through in his papacy. If he can sustain that, I think he'll transform the Catholic Church.
Yes. Can you talk about the public perception of the Catholic Church pre-Francis going through the scandals, and what you think Francis can do to change the public perception?
Well, I mean, he himself has addressed this about a rigorous church and moving away from it. We would know all about that in Ireland. You mightn't. But people of an older generation came out in a very rigorous Catholic tradition about do's and don'ts, and mainly don't. A very sort of severe form of religion and very punitive. And he wants to get away from all that towards a more compassionate, all-embracing, understanding. Mercy is a word he keeps coming up with. Non-condemnatory, like a phrase he used in the flight back from Brazil after World Youth Day last summer. He said, he was asked about gay people, and he says, "Who am I to judge?" His predecessor would not say so. His predecessor was unequivocal. In 1986, for instance, on gay people, he said they were objectively disordered with homosexuality, rather, was objectively disordered with a tendency towards moral evil, which is a shocking injunction. His predecessor was also dismissive of all Protestant religions as being and not churches in the proper sense. They were merely ecclesial communities. He said in a document in 2000, Dominus Jesus. He dismissed Hinduism. He said called it autoerotic spirituality. He had a bad word for everybody else, if you like. And I mean, at the same time, Benedict, in person, was a very mild-mannered, shy, retiring scholar who was at home most in the library or in the study, not out dealing with the public. I mean, he wasn't an extrovert like John Paul, his predecessor, or the current man. He was uneasy in public, and that came through. But as Dean of the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith from 1981 until he became Pope in 2005, the man was severe in the extreme. He knocked dissidents on the head. He was very narrow. He was rigid, and I don't think that is necessarily Christian. As you can tell, I was not a fan.
Just back to the type of young men coming through vocations now, would you say they're leaning more rigid, or would they be following Francis's footsteps more?
Well, that's too soon. Francis is only there a year, and it is a sad fact in my view, and a lot of people disagree with me, that a lot of the younger clergy today are deeply conservative in a way that the older clergy are not. The older clergy would have been men who came through or had their vocations in the immediate post-Vatican II period, the late 60s, and into the 70s under Paul VI, who was Pope until 1978, and his was a less severe form of Catholicism. That changed under John Paul, and it became a very rigid, revisionistic Catholicism, rowing back, as many people see, on the attempts by Vatican II to open up Catholicism to the world and to the thinking of the world. And I mean, the children of Don Paul, the Pope's children, if you like, and Benedict's are young men who had the vocation in those decades, those periods, from 1978 until last year, tend to be quite rigid. And I'd say for them, this papacy is a hell of a challenge. Not so much the older clergy or even the older bishops, but for the young guys who are ordained in the last 10 to 15 years, especially the last 10 years, this papacy is going to be a challenge, and already is, because they are very orthodox, they're quite narrow, they are quite defined, and everything that goes with that, sort of the rigidity that goes with that, is part of their makeup, part of their psychology.
And you would say that was because of the previous pope?
Absolutely, because they took on board what was a very rigoristic form of Catholicism, and cut and dried, hard and fast, and one true church type stuff.
And do you think that could be also a reason for the decline in popularity of...
I think it's a factor. I think it's part of it. It attracted a certain type of personality, one that likes order, that needs it, that the security of that sort of rigid order. I don't think that they make necessarily the best pastors or the best priests. I'm sure some of them are, if not most of them. But I know in my dealings with some of them, with those young men, and older priests will say the same thing. They are quite judgmental and quite narrow, and that's sad.
We've actually overheard one of the young men saying about Pope Francis.
Yeah.
Just they don't like it.
No.
They don't like the way he's going on.
Yeah. And I mean, his style would be anathema to them. It's loose, it's untidy. He even uses the phrase about getting down and dirty with the sheep. In the gutter with the people. And if it rubs off on you, I can't remember that phraseology. So what? It's a matter of spirit, getting in there with the people and being with them in whatever, and not be worried about what the sort of the smell of the sheep, to use a phrase he did use. They would be very much more inclined to a different type of hygiene.
Grand. So we'll move on to the Catholic Church's recruiting techniques. Do you think the Church is doing enough to recruit young men in Ireland?
I think it's a hell of a task, even still. Things are improving. I do think there's a thawing going on there. I like, there's two posters out for the open day in Maynooth tomorrow. One is white collar workers wanted. It's clever. And another one is no sourpusses need apply, which is actually a phrase the Pope said when talking about Christians.
Do you think he's referring to the rigid kind of beliefs of the former Pope and anybody who might follow?
He would never be so unpolitical or apolitical as to refer to the former Pope in derogatory terms. But by inference, you could say nearly everything he has done is implicitly critical of what went before him, and not just his immediate predecessor, but certainly the latter period of John Paul. I thought it was very significant last Sunday in the canonization ceremonies. He devoted so much time to John the 23rd, comparatively little to John Paul II. And he talked about John Paul II and the family. And it wouldn't be the first thing that comes to mind to most people when they think about John Paul II. They might think about the fall of the Eastern Bloc or his travels around the world, whatever, not the family. And it mustn't be forgotten that this man, as a Pope, he had the prerogative to do so. He dispensed with the requirement of a second proven miracle before John the 23rd could be canonized. So spiritually, he'd be a son of John the 23rd, I would think, much more so than John Paul II. And that untidiness, that easy embrace, that intellectual untidiness even, is liberating in many ways for, if you like, true Christian tolerance, and I think he embodies that, as John the 23rd did. John the 23rd had a great sense of humour, and mind you, so did John Paul. Because one particular joke that John the 23rd is supposed to have told, which I always liked, is that he was once asked, Holy Father, how many people work in the Vatican? And he says, about half of them. A bit like the Irish Times. I wouldn't say the same with DIT, of course not.
Finally, well, just about that, you're saying some interesting stuff about the actual the posters that are being used for the recruitment. Yeah. Is there much of that kind of clever marketing going on at the minute?
There has been some.
Sorry to be awkward, but
yeah,
of course. There has been some. I can't remember. There's one that was on the Dart a few years ago as well, on the same lines. These sort of clever marketing lines, which I don't know how successful or effective they are from the point of view of recruiting young men to the priesthood, but they are eye-catching and they do make people talk. And I suppose that's what advertising is supposed to be about. And I expect it may help in some sense, but I think it takes a bit more than that to encourage a young man to commit himself to a lifetime as a priest.
So with Francis now and kind of the positive tide changing, do you think the Irish Church is ready to kind of take advantage of this positive tide?
Well, the Irish Church is in an unusual situation. You're seeing a lot of older bishops retiring, and therefore quite a number of younger bishops being appointed. We have to wait and see how these men will respond to Francis. certainly I think the leadership in Dublin would be very much oriented towards the Francis line of thinking. I suspect the same of the new man Armagh when he takes over. He's only 51 himself, 52 this year. So I mean, by the very nature of things, these men will promote what comes out of Rome. But what is interesting is that it would appear that one of the things that John or Francis is intent on bringing about is a devolution in governance from Rome to the diocese, indeed to the parish, and more collegiality, the bringing on board of bishops into decision making. We have had some indication of that so far. He made a worldwide survey on various questions submitted to Catholics worldwide before Christmas, in anticipation of a Synod on the Family starting. There's one in October, there's another one next year, asking people about issues related to the family and church teaching. And the answers in Europe particularly, and indeed in Ireland, were quite radical. The church most Catholics don't accept church teaching on contraception, which is hardly a surprise, on the prevention of married and divorced Catholics from going to communion. Most people don't agree with that. Most people don't agree with the church's teaching on homosexuality. There are some who disagree with the church's teaching on abortion. So, I mean, and the people have been very honest with that. It'll be interesting to see how much of that he will take on board, or the bishops will, at their synod this year and next year.
Perfect. And just something we want to touch on very quickly is, what do you think of African priests coming over to fill the void?
I think it's mythology. You'll have some, but I don't think you're going to have African priests to fill the void. African priests are needed in Africa. It's not as if certainly the seminaries are burgeoning in parts of Nigeria, but Nigeria needs its own priests because Islam is making such a huge impact there. It is the most Muslim country in Africa. People forget that, and it is also quite aggressive. An aggressive form of Islam, and there have been clashes there, as we see recently in Central Africa, between Muslims and Christians, and indeed, as always happens in these clashes, one side is as bad as the other. Religion doesn't seem to have much to do with it. It's tribal, as we know from our own history. It's more a question of tribal identity than religion, if there were to be. And either side abide by the tenets of their own beliefs, they wouldn't be killing one another. But no, Africa needs its own priests. There may be some who come here, but I suspect that we'll have to produce our own, and we will. And people forget that before the famine, Ireland had very few priests. Catholicism survived in Ireland. Most of them were trained in continental Europe. People also forget that Maynooth was established by the British government because they were afraid that Irish priests trained abroad, and there were at one time 40 Irish colleges abroad training priests, that these guys would be influenced by the ideas of the French Revolution, which took place in 1789. So in the 1790s they established Maynooth, and it was by the British government, and it was to create an Irish priesthood for Ireland. And they brought on board a very, very narrow type of Jansenism, body-hating type of theology, which really fed into a particular Irish attitude to sexuality, which we're still dealing with in many ways from a clerical or from a church point of view, but wasn't peculiar to Ireland, but really took root here in a way it didn't in Italy or Spain or the Latin Catholic countries. No, I mean, mass attendance before the famine was very low, and as low as it has become now here. I mean, mass attendance in Dublin is about 16% on average. In working class parishes, it's down to 2 and 3%. The average figure nationally is 33. But the demographic is also very significant. Here in Dublin, or nationally, the age profile is old. Very few young people in any church anywhere in Ireland. And it's not peculiar to Catholicism. You find the same in the Protestant churches. The Church of Ireland General Assembly is on next week. The Presbyterian General Assembly is on next month. Every year you go there, it's the same story. Declining numbers, declining numbers, declining numbers. What are we going to do about it? That's all they do. They wring their hands about it. But all denominations, Christian denominations in Ireland, are experiencing a decline in attendance, and particularly where it comes to young people. And none of them have cracked it. It's a bit like the newspapers trying to crack how to get the online pay so the print tradition can survive. So, I mean, no, none of them have really found a way to bring back young people.
So just last question.
Yeah, I'll just restart the camera very briefly. There we are.
Right, so last question. Ireland Catholic Church in 30 years, are you optimistic or do you have doubts?
I have absolutely no doubt that the Catholic Church will still be here in Ireland in 30 years' time, and the other ones, the other Protestant churches as well. It seems to be feature of human society, that there's a need for religion. Some people in society need belief, they need faith, and however it manifests itself is a matter of the times or whatever. Catholicism in Ireland has had a very traumatic history. It has been through shocking times. The penal laws, which basically was about impoverishing and rendering ignorant, and it did it very successfully, the Irish Catholic population. And that's one reason Catholicism became such a powerful force in Ireland in the 20th century, is that it came out of this period of persecution, and the people identified with it as part of their identity. They were persecuted because they were Catholic and Irish. And the two were seen as synonymous right through most of the 20th century. And the Catholic Church then went through the heroic phase. The priest was hunted, he was shot or killed, or hung rather, if he was caught. Then it went through the sort of successful phase, and in the 20th century the triumphant phase, when they became like a beggar on horseback, the abusive phase, and it's now in serious decline. So I mean, but that is just cyclical. It's like the economy, except it's over a longer period. And I have no doubt it will revive in a different form and in a new form. You'll have less priests. You'll have a greater amount of laity involved in church activity in general, including up to and including liturgy. So it is now changing form. What form it's going to have, I can't tell you. I don't know. I do believe that you said there'll be much more lay involvement. It'll be a less clerical church because there'll be less clergy. And beyond that, I can't say.
Marriage or women, do you think?
Which?
The priests being allowed to marry? Or?
I do believe that mandatory celibacy will go. It'll be optional. It'll become like you have in the Orthodox context, where bishops don't marry, well, priests can. But don't forget, you already have married Catholic priests in the Latin Rite over in the Middle East. And here, in the previous Pope Benedict created this particular patriarchate, it's called, for married Anglican clergy who couldn't accept the idea of priests, married women bishops in the Anglican Church, and are now married Catholic priests with families. So the mechanism is there. It is only a discipline of the church. It's not a dogma or a teaching of the church. So I do see celibacy going. Then,
sorry, just on celibacy, do you think that's holding back young men from?
I'm sure it's a factor. And again, I mean, there are a lot of men who left the church over the last number of decades to marry, but who are still, I mean, believing and practicing Catholics, who are priests and are available to the church, had it the wit to get rid of that particular discipline. I think that will go. I think that this Pope too will allow, and he already has it in every sense of the word except actually saying it, allow married and divorced Catholics to take communion. It's clear he won't allow women priests. How that happens in time, I don't know. I think it's quite possible. I mean, the Protestant churches have been through this debate and out the other end. Here in Ireland, we have not only women priests, we have now a woman bishop, the first woman bishop in these islands, Bishop Patsy, Church of Ireland Bishop of Meath and Kildare, who was consecrated last December. In England, they're still wrestling with the issue of women bishops, because foolishly, unlike here in Ireland, they dealt with the two in one. If you were eligible to become a woman priest, you're also automatically eligible to become a bishop. In England, they kept it separate, and so they decided to allow women bishops, and they're now cutting each other's throats, metaphorically speaking, over the issue of women bishops. Yes, in time, I can see women becoming ordained in the Catholic Church as well. As regards its attitude to homosexuality, that's softening under Francis. On contraception, I can't see him going back on Humanae Vitae. It was just such a profoundly influential encyclical. I think it was hugely damaging for the Catholic Church. I think in Ireland, it ushered in a period where Catholics in Ireland challenged the Pope for the very first time, through necessity. I mean, women in particular. Of course, we did find an Irish solution to an Irish problem around that particular teaching as well, in that, I mean, Irish women in their tens of thousands took the pill not as a contraceptive, but as a regulator. I mean, fine. There was the double effect. It did prevent conception, but the priests would allow that, and the doctor would allow that. They could go along with that. It was where, I mean, condoms were concerned that it became an issue. But I mean, that teaching has undermined papal authority hugely across the world, and it's ignored. I mean, as the old saying goes, it's honoured by Catholics more in the breach than the observance. I don't know. I'd say the number of Catholics who abide by Humanae Vitae are very, very small indeed. I mean, look at this country. I come from a family of 7. There are very few families of 7 anymore in Ireland. Why? I mean, we're having less sex? I don't think so. But yeah.
That's grand, yeah.
That's
it, yeah.
that's excellent. Thank you very much.
That's excellent. Thanks very much.
You're very welcome, lads.
For your time.
Took much more of our time than we said we would as well. Thank you
My,
very much.
my,
Cheers.
my
Thank you.
mum and dad come from families of 10 each, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
My mum's one of 14, so.
She.
Yeah.
God, yeah, so.